Welcome to another episode of Learn with Avthar. This is the podcast that helps you become a learning machine. And speaking of learning, today we're going to go deep into the topics of learning, mastery, and education. In this episode, I talk with the person that I call the most for learning advice. His name is Nic Voge. I worked under Nic as a learning coach at Princeton University, and Nic is one of the most knowledgeable people I've ever met when it comes to learning and education in high performance, high intensity environments. Nic is an extremely accomplished person. He holds a master's degree focusing on learning and literacy and has worked with some of the world's brightest students in the most demanding university environments, spending 10 years coordinating the Study Strategies program at University of California, Berkeley, and 12 years at Princeton University, where he's currently the Senior Associate Director of the McGraw Center for Teaching and Learning. There he oversees over 180 tutors, graduate fellows, learning consultants, and professional learning strategists. Nic is also a published author, with his book Life Beyond Grades being one of the topics we get into in this episode. Now, what can you look forward to learning from this episode? We get into what it's like helping students at America's best university and learn the difference between tutors and learning consultants, and talk a little bit about my experience working with Nic in that capacity. We also discuss higher education in general, particularly what it's like at elite institutions in the USA, and go deep into the question of why is college so hard. Nic also talks about insights into performance and what prevents it, and we get into overcoming procrastination using cognitive psychology and the idea of motivational stacking. So that's something definitely to look out for. And finally, we go deep into the topics of self-worth, success, and life beyond grades and metrics. It's probably my favorite part of this conversation. And what you'll get is a glimpse into what makes Nic an expert, not just in learning and performance, but also in thriving and fulfillment. Now, if you enjoy this episode, please join my weekly email. It's called Avthar's Weekly Wisdom, where you'll discover one thing each week that will change your life in the realms of startups, self-mastery, health, and happiness. You can learn more and join at www.avthar.com. That's avthar.com. And I hope you've got a pen and paper ready or the notes app on your phone open, because you're going to need it for all the gems in this episode. Please enjoy my conversation with the master of learning, Nic Voge. I thought that the place that we could start is on this point about your career journey in education and learning. I'm curious about how you decided that this was something that you wanted to do before we get into the kind of work that you've done. One of the themes that I've written about and that we've chatted a little bit about on this podcast is how does someone find their natural strengths and natural interests? So how did introspecting on that lead you to the topic of learning and education?
Yeah, I think that there was some finding and searching and some serendipity and happenstance. I have far back to go exactly, but what I consider my work to be now is certainly about the methods and processes of learning and how people understand and navigate a college education and to do that well. And that vision for myself and that understanding has continued to broaden over the last 30 years. But it really started my first real job out of college. I went to Japan and taught English, but I really wasn't committed to teaching. I really wanted to live abroad and I wanted to make money and travel the world. And that's what I did. But I did gain some experience and I returned back to the United States and I got a job in education, and this time teaching reading. But really in terms of the path that I'm on now, that didn't really come into focus until I went to graduate school at UC Berkeley. And my initial focus was on, and the Graduate School of Education was on reading and learning with text and literacy. And I got really interested in that topic. And then my particular focus was on college age students, which is there's not a whole lot of people thinking about that. When you think reading or literacy, you're thinking of little kids. So it was already an unusual kind of focus. And then I was looking for a job. I needed to work. And so I got a job in a learning center. And most universities nowadays have learning centers, and Berkeley has quite a good one. It's called the Student Learning Center. And not only did I get a chance to pursue my interests. I was lucky. I was actually doing things related to my research interests, but I met a community, a very dedicated community of educators. And that was very validating and rewarding. And you might be surprised, even in a school of education and at a research university, people aren't mainly teachers. They're mainly researchers. But at that point in my career, I wasn't really sure if I wanted to do research or what. I didn't even know what it was exactly. In any case, but so it started with a community. And then being immersed in that community, seeing their passion, was really important. And I think a second thing is that by this point, I was really fascinated in the mental processes of learning, but also the social and cultural dimensions of learning and literacy. And so I was just fascinated by that. So I would describe that as the passion that a lot of people talk about. Okay, you have a passion. It's hard to explain why you love physics. You can give an explanation, and that some of that's true. But why do I love this? I just did. I was intricately fascinated, and I would go around with this question in my head: what is reading? What is reading? What is reading? And answering in lots of different ways. I think when I really found my path and my calling is when that fascination got combined with a mission. And they're different things. And the mission became, how do I help people college students who get into places like Princeton, or before that in Berkeley, who that institution really isn't designed for them? How do I help them have an educational experience to not to just gain access to the institution, but to gain access to the kind of education and the educational materials that's going to be transformative? And then given the American education system and how inequitable it is, that students are coming in with really different backgrounds and preparations. And if I could then intervene in that and make places, really demanding, challenging places like Berkeley and Princeton, something that students felt that they could master, that they had the tools and the skills and strategies to be able to navigate that on the intellectual level, that was my particular place. And that's connected to my own personal educational journey. One way to say it too is I wanted people to have college educational experiences that I didn't have. I was focused on grades and learning, and I did fine, but I wasn't changed by my education very much, not my undergraduate. And so when those two things came together, that passion, just the fascination with a social purpose, something that brought meaning and was a calling and was in service to others, then I was on the path. I was just, it was all meaningful, it was all purposeful, and almost always enjoyable too.
I love the way that you described it, where you talk about how you combined both something that you were curious about, or in your words, fascinated about, with the mission giving you your why, your purpose in some ways. And I think that I just find it interesting to see how that combination keeps coming up, where you can have a vision for what you want to do in the world, but the particular way that you bring that about needs to be in a way that is natural to you. I always talk about this theme of finding your own way to do things. So you can have athletes, or even as students, you can have people who are very successful and who achieve a lot of things, but they have a certain way of going about it. And if you copy what they do, if you copy the methods or the tactics or something like that, you won't get to where they got to, because you need to find your own way there. And so I love how that's manifested in your own career.
I completely agree. One thing I should add for the purposes of your audience is I didn't realize that was going on exactly.
This is all. Yeah, no, totally. But it's good to see and to sit down and reflect. One of the reasons why I love doing this podcast is to have these kinds of conversations where in everyday life we're always busy trying to do the next project or check the next thing off our to-do list, that these kinds of things give us a break to think about the bigger picture. And that's kind of what I like to focus on from just how you got interested in reading and learning and education. I'm curious about the academic environments, particularly at Berkeley and Princeton, the two places that you've worked the most with. How would you characterize them, and do you find like any differences between them? Because I know that as someone who's experienced the environment of Princeton, I know what it feels like, but I'm curious about, as someone who has worked there for many years, what specifically about it makes it such a challenging place to be as a student?
Yeah. Good question. And they're challenging. Those two institutions are outstanding in their own ways, and they're challenging in similar and different ways, actually. So if I were to describe this to try to help a college student make sense of their own experience, particularly academically, at least that is a starting point, because the academic experience quickly becomes our personal experience, our experience of ourselves and our social experience. But I think both those institutions, their character originates from their mission. They're both research universities. And while Princeton also puts a great deal of emphasis on the undergraduate education, it is foremost a research university. And so what are the consequences of that for students, and the intensity? And the intensity, I might just use the word mismatch. This institution is not prepared for students, frankly, undergraduate students very well in many
Yeah,
cases. And then the students really cannot be very well prepared for a research university because there's no such thing as a research high school. It's just a different type of institution that we
exactly.
haven't encountered.
The things that we chatted about during my time working for you at Princeton in the Learning Consultants program is this whole idea of the mismatch between the incentives of the student and the incentives of the institution. In this case, with Princeton, the incentive is to produce world-class research, get papers published, get awards. Obviously, you want students to graduate, but many of the students don't have any interest in research. I'm not sure what percentage, but there's a large majority of students who have never heard of research and don't have any interest in going into that. So how does that mismatch play out in your experience, and what are the consequences of that?
Yeah, so a good question and concretely. So these research universities are faculty centric. Their mission is to create new knowledge, and they're designed to do that. The resources are organized and distributed that way. The incentives are organized that way. Even the emphasis on graduate education, say at Berkeley. And so that's what faculty are rewarded for. And it's what becomes the metric of the institution. And so that just means that the energy of most of the participants is not aimed at educating and training undergraduate students. But how does that a little more concretely in terms of the teaching and learning students themselves? I can break that down. So one is, faculty are selected not because of their teaching prowess. That's not the criteria by which they have come to be there. Secondly, they're not rewarded for putting a lot of energy or time into that. In fact, they're often dissuaded from doing that overtly and tacitly. And the faculty themselves, that's not their primary interest. So some are fantastic citizens of the institution and will want to be good at everything they do and are quite diligent and conscientious. And so they become good teachers and by other means as well. That's not really rewarded. It's basically the equivalent for students of saying, how many assignments are you doing in a class where you don't get any points? Very few.
Exactly.
If you're putting energy and effort into becoming a better teacher, then that's faculty putting energy into assignments for which they're not going to be graded. They're not going to be rewarded.
No one got tenure for teaching awards received. It's always for the publications that you publish or the research that you do. One aside that I want to mention before I let you carry on with the consequences is, I was joking with a friend of mine that one of the biggest benefits of going to a school at like Princeton is that you become an expert in teaching yourself very complex things. And that's as a result of, you can have someone who's very knowledgeable in a certain area. You see this a lot of the time in subjects that I studied, engineering, computer science, where someone is extremely technical, they have their way of understanding things. But when they teach it, they're teaching the way that they understand it, assuming that this is the one way of looking at the subject. When in reality, there's a myriad of ways of approaching things. And so you as a student, if you don't understand it their way, they're going to be like, oh, there's something wrong with you. You need to work harder. You need to come to office hours. And so as a result, you become very good at teaching yourself and trying to make sense of things with yourself and with your study group and stuff like that.
Well, great point. I think one of the things that's difficult for Princeton students then is to come to learn this, just that message. They don't expect that. They actually think their professors are like super teachers. And so if they're not learning, then it must be them. And then that experience and that interpretation actually undermines their motivation and engagement. So that is one of the reasons it's difficult too, because the messaging to students about what happens in college doesn't reflect the reality. And then they go, well, this isn't quite what I thought. I'm having to teach myself, but I came to Princeton or I came to this place because I was going to have these great teachers. And so that doesn't make a lot of sense. And I think that disconnect, again, can actually affect students' learning through motivation and engagement. But there's other ways too. The discontinuity of the teaching and learning culture of higher ed, especially research university, from high school, in that you're not, for instance, you're not taught by, I've already mentioned this, you're not taught by people who are experts in teaching, you're taught by people who are experts in their discipline. And you've said this. So your computer science professor is a great technician, but they're also a technician in a particular way with a particular field, and they're not trained to teach beginners. And they're often not very interested in that. And you're going to get their particular flavor of it, their angle on it, which may be a good entree to the field, but often is not. But the main point is that even how the university, the knowledge is organized. Students think in terms of subjects, professors think in terms of disciplines. And in discipline, the emphasis is not on the object of study, actually. It's on the methods and approach and epistemology. So people are often concerned about, they think, oh, economists study numbers. Economists study happiness too. and so do psychologists, but they study it with very different methods and approaches and assumptions. And so one of the reasons college is hard and why these environments are intense is because you're being taught by disciplinary experts who approach their topics in very different ways. They also have different teaching and learning cultures. So the teaching cultures of different disciplines varies as well. So physicists will teach in certain ways that reflect their culture that's different than psychologists. So what is the consequence then? And in terms of learning, you've got now much more variety. Each class is its own environment that one has to adapt to and then learn to teach themselves. That is not the case for most high schools. And so that's really challenging. And in fact, I think in the most elite institutions, the most selective, where research is valued the most and professors have the most latitude, you'll see greater variety. So that demand of adapting to the variety will increase the higher rated the institution. Another thing is, Princeton is just, there's not very much time. It's a very short semester. And so that adds a great deal of intensity. There's other reasons that I think are more obvious or apparent. The competition. So your fellow students, even if there's not a curve, and although there often is a curve where you're basically pitted in competition to your fellow students, then they set the standards. And Princeton students will set the standard very high. And Berkeley students collectively will also set the standards very high. But then there's the faculty criteria. What is their standards? What do they believe are the criteria of achievement? And then something that doesn't get much attention is also the materials that you're taught with. The curricula itself in these places is quite different. There's actually a fairly rare at Princeton where a textbook, which is written as an instructional tool, designed for beginners, students, has all these features from indexes and glossaries and boldface prints and diagrams and questions at the end of the chapter. Those resources are pedagogical by design. They're often rarely used at Princeton, actually.
Yeah, that's super true. I think one of the things that we, again, focused a lot on in our learning consulting program is helping students leverage all these different resources at their disposal. Yeah. Where in high school and certainly in a lot of other environments, if you have a book for a class, the assumption is that book represents the level of complexity or the kind of things that you should take away in order to do well in the class. Therefore, if you read the book and you do well, if you read the book well and you understand it, the assumption is that translates into doing well on the test or in the class. And your point is that at Princeton, this is no longer true. The book is, yes, you can read for your own context, but I'm going to be dealing with things in a different way. And each professor has their own way of doing this. It's totally a non-uniform way of treating different materials.
Precisely. And so some of the things that happen, again, if we're unspooling or uncovering these consequences. So one is there's no instructional material that prepares you for the exam. The P sets are created by the professor. It's not in the book. Another thing is these materials, to learn from them as a novice in the field and not an expert, because most of the materials that are taught with, if the faculty eschew a textbook, are journal articles and things that are written by experts for experts. These materials to be learned from efficiently and adequately by students would need to be contextualized much more than professors do. So one way to put it so simply is professors places like this don't use textbooks very much, but they teach as if they do. So a textbook provides the context to the learner. So the professors don't need to provide it. But if you don't use the textbook, then you do. Or what happens is they say, okay, you find the context in the textbook and use it as needed. But often students don't feel they have enough time for that, or they don't realize that's what the function of the textbook is. So that's getting into the weeds a little bit. I think there's that's what I'm interested in, is learning and reading. So
same here.
But I think there's some other demands that are going on top of that, which have to do with self-direction. There's just a lot less guidance. You get a lot less instructional time, but you're expected to learn more. Who's making all those decisions? That's where the teaching yourself comes in. And that not only does it require then insight into how people learn, it also has some insight into how does this curriculum organize? How am I going to be assessed? And these are bodies of knowledge that most 18, 19-year-olds really know very little about. And then because you're making all these decisions, then you're making about when to study, how to study, what to study, then that's about self-management. That's about emotional management, self-regulation, allocation of energy and attention. Those are another realm altogether.
I think what you've highlighted is that the trick to doing well at these sorts of institutions is not as simple as work hard and you'll succeed, because of just the multivariate nature of all the challenges that students are facing. And then that's then compounded by the fact that people come from different backgrounds. International students have a very different level of preparedness for the American college experience, especially for places like Princeton and Berkeley. All that kind of leads to the next topic that I want to chat about. You've spent a lot of your work providing to these students in the form of one example is the Learning Consultants Program, which you and I worked in, but also just the Centers for Teaching and Learning. So I'm curious about how these centers broadly aim to provide support for students, and how do you guys aim to operate like within this institution to support students and trying to basically tell them like, hey, you guys don't really know what you're in for, but fortunately we've seen other students come in here and here's some things that might be helpful to you with regards to self-management, learning strategies, understanding structure of different courses in the institution, etc.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a big question. I think I might divide it into two pieces. One is about the field, the community of people who provide learning support or academic support. There's the learning centers are widespread. I'm active in that community. I have been for, about 25 years now. And I think it's really essential. It's grown. And there's a lot of approaches that I share in common, but I would underscore, and I'll come back to this later, a few things that I approach my work differently. You said earlier about people making their own way.
Finding your own way.
Yeah, and my way into this work actually differs from most people in it, intellectually and theoretically, and perhaps even philosophically. So I'll come back to that. But I think what I would like to say about these learning programs, learning support programs and learning centers is there's a recognition of the gaps that we're talking about. Most of them will attribute the gap to deficiency in students, which I understand. But when you work at places like Berkeley and Princeton that select the best students in the world, it's really hard to say, oh yeah, what's wrong with these students? What do you mean? They're the best students in the world. If there's something wrong with them, then there's wrong with everybody. So then what is the meaning of saying there's something wrong with them or they're lacking or a gap? So I think it's much more useful to think about a mismatch between what K-12 education does and what students learn from it and what a place like a research university like Princeton or Berkeley does. And then to try to unpack that and uncover these invisible differences. And some of those can be certainly understood cognitively in terms of the demands and mental processes, also motivation and some of the things we were just talking about, self-regulation. But for me, so that's what these programs are trying, I think the best of them are trying to do. And then how that gets translated into specific places is to look at those demands and then especially the new demands of students that are placed on them by particular courses and demands. And then how do we provide students with the skills and tools to meet those demands and in particular fill some gaps. So I'm going to highlight one example with respect to tutoring, and then I'll come back to consultations. So for instance, the McGraw Center tutoring program at Princeton, we don't think of tutoring as a sort of catch-all. Oh, you didn't learn something in class, and we're going to cover everything that happens in class, and we're going to catch you up. Actually, we don't think about that at all. And it's very different. I sometimes call that the Swiss Army approach to tutoring. Whatever you need, we'll give you. Whatever you didn't get in class, what we do is we look at the curriculum and say, what's hard about Princeton courses? And I would say, and you've alluded to this already, is the discrepancy or the gap between the instruction, the P sets, and then there's a huge leap to the exam level problems. And not only is that, so we would call that in cognitive psychology transfer, or sometimes called far transfer, to take the knowledge you learned in one context and apply it creatively in another. That transfer is widely recognized as the hardest thing to learn in any field. So we focus on that, number one, because it's the hardest thing to learn. And so we want more focus on that. Secondly, if we can help students understand that's what they want to get good grades, and we're happy to support them getting good grades. And if it's a well-designed course and a well-designed test, learning how to apply and transfer the knowledge will get you the good grade, and that is the goal. But there's another reason, a third reason, and this is reflective of the approach, which is not only is transfer the hardest to learn, and arguably the most important, certainly to get a high grade is the most important thing to learn, it's taught the least.
Exactly. It's a thing that they expect you to figure out on your own.
So if I abstract out, what I'm saying then is I want to think about the nature of instruction, the nature of learning, and then the particular way that you're taught here. And so I think that's reflective of, to some extent, almost like an anthropological approach, but I do know psychology, I know cognition in particular. So I prefer to call it like an ecological approach. You're looking at the individual, or from ecology, the organism in relation to other organisms in the system. So in the case of a kind of social ecology or an educational ecology, it's knowing something about Princeton students in particular. It's knowing something about Princeton instruction in particular, knowing things about Princeton students' motivations and assessment at Princeton. And so that local ecology is really important. So we design our programming around that. And so what happens in tutoring then is it's all framed around, how do I learn how to solve exam level problems? And how do I use the materials that are available to me in the class? In this case, from P-sets. And so that's our focus. And I would contrast that, I might call that like a surgical or a scalpel in contrast to the Swiss Army knife. We're not going to go over course content and we're not going to cover how to do the readings and the lecture. We're going to focus in on this one area that we think is pivotal and is under-taught. And if people can learn how to do that, how to transfer knowledge, that is an abstract cognitive skill that has wide applications. But we actually start more with the concrete and specific. And I think, so one thing that's different in my approach than others is most people in this field are actually coming more from a cognitive, psychological point of view, some people from a neurological, but they're looking at universal principles. So they would say, okay, transfer, let's break that down. And then we would say, go to the students, you apply that to your class. I go the other direction. It's much more inductive. Let's look at the particular class. Let's think about what the demands are. Let's bring to bear what we know about cognitive psychology so you can develop that knowledge and that skill, but it's from the particular to the general, not the general to the particular.
Exactly. I love the way that you just put it. There's a concept by one of my favorite authors on learning. His name is Josh Waitzkin. He was a chess world champion and jiu-jitsu black belt and Tai Chi push hands world champion as well. So again, very focused practitioner. But what he calls this principle is learning the macro from the micro, which is what you were talking about, where you focus on these specific environments or this very specific thing, and then trying to generalize up versus trying to say, okay, let's start at the most general level and then hope that it trickles down from there. Go ahead.
I'm just going to actually explain that principle in terms of transfer, because if you start from the abstract, then again, you're saying, okay, you, the student, transfer it to the particular. Again, you're asking the student to do the hardest thing.
Yeah.
And we want to flip that around. There's a great quote from Tolstoy who said, for the beginner, I don't have it exactly memorized, I was trying to look it up, but he said, for the beginner, this particular, the specific, the messiness of the situation, the local, is actually really crucial to learning. Abstraction comes later. And that, again, that's actually one of the reasons why it's so hard for students to learn from professors. They're trying to work at the most abstract level. So it's phenomenal that Newton could explain all of physics in 3 principles. And that is a really powerful tool if you understand those 3 laws of mechanics. Super powerful. But it is not a good place for beginners to start. It's too abstract. It's too far away from the particular of experience. And so I would argue that there's something analogous there when we're trying to teach people about learning, starting with broad psychological principles. Very useful for the researcher, for the expert, but often inaccessible to the beginner.
How does the structure of the learning consultant program contrast with that of the tutoring program? Because I think for most people, they have heard of tutoring, and you've just explained that it really focuses on the specific content of the course. So a mathematics tutor would be tutoring in calculus or linear algebra or other sorts of things. Whereas there's a program that many people might have not heard of before, something that I've written about in my newsletter, which is being a learning consultant. So you could just tell people a little bit about that and how does that contrast with the tutoring program?
Yeah. I think probably a term that more people would know that's captures the most of the essence of a learning consultant is academic coaching. So there's an analog to life coaching or performance coaching, productivity coaching. And so it's useful to make the distinction between and use the metaphor of the coach in contrast to a tutor. And there's a lot in common. There's some things that overlap, particularly in terms of the active engagement. But a consultant is focused on the methods and processes of learning, the approach, and not so much the content of this particular subject matter. So it's a great emphasis on metacognition. So the thinking about thinking and about strategizing. So one of the ways I'll describe a learning consultation is it's a process of shared and collaborative strategizing.
Uh-huh.
And so strategizing has a few components. One is an analysis of the situation and any kind of difficulty or problem about it. And it's not like a doctor, so we can contrast it with a doctor, and that the consultant is diagnosing for the student, the would-be patient, what's wrong. That's not the role. Not because they couldn't, but because that doesn't equip the student then to do their own diagnosis going forward. So that's a kind of coaching model. What a coach wants to do is not do the task for you. So a coach doesn't want the soccer player, to diagnose the problem. They want the player to figure it out. A physician would be less inclined for that. And maybe the tutor would be less inclined to do that too. But a consultant, we're thinking ahead. You're going to make all these decisions about strategizing in future situations. So you're not going to meet with me every day about every situation. What we want to transfer is that you learn how to analyze situations, think about solutions, assemble a realistic action plan, think about the process of behavior change, and then implement that. And so what a consultant does is it fosters and facilitates that by having a structured approach to that process. Now, tutoring could include things like that, and it might at a micro level, like there's some similarities you might think about, like strategize how to solve a problem in physics, and that's true. It's not a hard and fast distinction, but the relative emphasis is on empowering the student to engage in a process that makes the consultant themselves obsolete, and that is very transferable. I think some other big ideas that distinguish learning consultants from tutoring is a very explicit sense that the student, or the consultee would be better just for clarity, the consultee brings some really essential information and knowledge into the interaction in a way that many teachers or tutors don't think that students do. We cannot do what we do as consultants relying on what we know. We absolutely have to rely on what the student knows about themselves, their past, their background, their approach to learning, their profile as motivationally, the context and courses they're in. And so the nature of the interaction is much more egalitarian. It's much more of an exchange.
One of the phrases that I remember we used when we were chatting amongst students who were learning consultants at the time is that the person that you're speaking to is always going to be the expert in their own life. They're always going to know more about the exact demands of what's going on. They're going to know about their motivations and going to know about what's standing in their way, at least deep down inside. And one of our jobs is to walk them down the path to see for themselves what is it that they can do. And of course, we have a toolkit of suggestions and things that we could make. But ultimately, as you said, it's not so much learning consultants telling them, here's what you have to do and here's your 5-step plan, but it's more about showing them that, okay, this seems to be the way that you want to go. And here are some different ways that you could get there. You need to pick which is the best one for you. And of course, we're there to support. And I had a few consultees who I saw every 2 weeks or so, where it was like a constant thing. But in majority of the cases, it's just a one-off sort of reorientation of the student towards the direction that they're trying to go.
I think that's really well said. And so what are the things that can come out of that? I think that differ from tutoring. And then a lot of the most important things that come out of learning consultants are realizations and self-awareness. So realizations about oneself and one's approach. And certainly that could happen in tutoring. But so I think ultimately the most valuable knowledge probably is of a different order in consulting. Even as it's applied to a particular course or task, it tends to be much more about the individual, and that's intentional, right? And there's a way in that sense that perhaps that's like mentoring, in the sense that I think a good mentor is helping students or the mentee gain awareness of themselves, even as they're imparting knowledge, because that's more durable knowledge. That's the thing that's really going to be more useful. This
Yeah.
situation in front of us will probably won't arise again. So I think those are some important things. I think another key idea, it's not necessarily distinct from tutoring, but is crucial to learning consultations, is not only that the student is the authority on themselves, but a starting belief that they probably can solve the problem themselves. They possess the knowledge, skills, and strategies to do that. And even if they don't always, we want to start there, because if I start with an understanding that you don't know what you need to do, that will often lead me to do more than I should, or to communicate to students, I don't think you can do it. That is not a healthy message to send, and often also can stifle the exchange. And I think it's almost always true, particularly the highly capable, highly prepared Princeton students. Now, but there are certain cultural things about a place like Princeton that you just cannot know because it's distinct and local. So it is useful for the consultant to know what are things that the student could not have discovered at this juncture, or would be unlikely to. So it's not that and this is a key point, so we want to withhold our intervention so that we don't interrupt the process of the student doing analysis, doing self-reflection, entertaining possible options, making choices about what I think is going to be the best. We don't want to interrupt those processes. And so one way to do that is to not simply give advice. But we don't simply withhold advice in order to withhold advice. We do it at a particular moment when the student is receptive. And then even then, the student is always empowered to make judgments about that. So it's not that we think it's the best approach, it's do they believe it's applicable to them? Are they going to implement it? Is it realistic? And ultimately, the student is the arbiter. So we need to, in a learning consultation, we need to empower students in a way that sometimes is uncomfortable to them or unfamiliar. And I think that's less likely in tutoring, but I also think that the best tutoring approximates that and approaches these same ideas, but somewhat differently.
100%. I think one thing that you touched upon is almost the Socratic dialogue nature of the learning consultations, at least the ones that I used to do and the ones that I've heard from friends who are also learning consultants, is that a lot of people want to come in and be given an answer. And there's nothing wrong about that. That's just a symptom of them being in a place where they're scared or they're fearful and they want to make that pain go away. But unfortunately, as you said, the kind of knowledge that they really want isn't just to solve their problem, their specific problem, but to solve the fact that they have a problem that they don't think that they can solve. That's the meta problem that they're dealing with. And by walking them down this path of, I used to call it, I think you mentioned this term, self-discovery, you really lead them down, and through the use of questions and through the use of guiding them through their own introspection, help them figure out what they probably didn't make time to see before because they're so busy with just dealing with the day-to-day demands of submitting P-sets and making it to dance practice or something like that.
Yeah, I think so. I think that was well articulated. I think one little tiny addition to that is sometimes a question evokes a slightly different angle, or allows us to put together facts or information that we hadn't actually linked. And when we link them, then we get some insight. So it wasn't that the information or knowledge wasn't there. It's just we'd never made the connection before. And an external question or prompt, and then time to do that, and an orientation or a mode of introspection and reflection is often necessary. But in places like Princeton and Berkeley, that time and that inclination is incredibly rare and extremely precious. It's so hard to create that. And so I think a big part of it is just creating space and time, and then a mental attitude to do it. And then some skill for sure in the consultants and people like you who are attentive and paying attention and present and listen and then ask the next question, the one that brings growth. It's much easier to give an answer, to say, hey, you should do this. It's much harder to actually think through what's going on. And then as the consultant to say, what would be a prompt or a question that would help the student come to their realization? I've made an insight, but how are they going to make the insight? It's very easy once you made an insight just to share it. As a tutor, you're like, oh, I know what to do. I just tell you. Much harder to say strategically, what do I need to say or do to help the student make that same insight for themselves? That requires far more skill.
So I think that deep down inside, no one really wants to be told what to do. And so if as a consultant, you tell them that, hey, this is your problem and I've had this problem before and this is what you need to do. This is how I solved it. They're taking that from you on authority. And I think sometimes when you don't actually hold that authority in their mind, they're not going to follow up with it. And while you might feel good as a consultant, ultimately they're not going to actually make any change. And I don't want to say failed, but that was an opportunity that they went through suffering that you could have prevented. And so I think there it's like, if they can understand something for themselves, that aha moment becomes so much more powerful and it sticks so much more because they're the ones who've led themselves.
That's a really great point. I've never thought of it quite from that angle, but I think that's right. And so again, that's maybe something that distinguishes learning consultants is we want to create a role and a relationship for the student where they're the arbiter. They decide, they are empowered to make decisions and to reject information or incorporate it, that they set up the filter. They are setting the standards and criteria of what counts as this is an answer or it's not, or this is good advice or it's not.
Exactly. 100%. I want to switch gears a little bit to talk about a theme that I think that you've articulated really well in your books and your TED Talk. Reading your book, Life Beyond Grades, I have a copy right here. For those who are watching the video on YouTube later, you should definitely pick this up. And then also watch your TED Talk, which has more than 300,000 views on YouTube. One of the key themes there is this idea of self-worth theory. And this is something that I think applies to both students, but to everyone in the world, young professionals. A lot of people listening to this are in the corporate world, in the working world. And there's one equation that I want you to explain just as a starting point into this. And that is performance equals ability equals worth. P equals A equals W. Could you chat us through that equation and what it means and whether or not it's true or not?
Yeah. You got to the heart of self-worth theory, particularly in an academic context. And this idea of the P equals W. So the first idea is that this is meant to simplify and crystallize a set of interlocking beliefs that many people carry around with them in their head about the relationship with their own personal worth as a human being and how that's connected in their own mind and in the minds of other people in terms of their ability, and then how that is equated to their performance. So the idea is that I'm as worthy as my grades. My performance equates to my worth as a person. So the A students, the good students, are good people, right? I'm an A student, I'm an A person, so to speak. And that's mediated through our beliefs about our ability. One of the reasons that my grades reflect my worth is because the grades reflect my ability, which is fairly enduring and inherent and static. So I am my ability, and in a world that values people's abilities on the market or elsewhere, then I'm equivalent to my worth. And that we learn that as people, and certainly as children, both children in families and also children in school, by our performances. The A students get singled out. The one way I'll put it is the good students quickly just become, the students who get good grades quickly just become the good students, and they just become good. It just gets all compressed. And so this is a reflection of particular beliefs and frameworks and social processes that I think many people have internalized, and they can believe it even if they don't agree with it. So I just want to say, number one, I don't think this is how people's worth should be measured. And I think a lot of people, in fact, most people, at least in the Western American context that I know, would say, I agree, people shouldn't be. But nonetheless, we have actually internalized that equation and that belief, even though we disagree with it.
And this is the conditioning that people have. If you were to tell someone that, hey, would you want this to be the way that you feel about yourself and for your mind to work, 99% of people would reject it. But the fact remains that many people are walking around with this is a program running in their brain, whether or not they're conscious of it or not.
Precisely. So that's a kind of schema. And we can point to it, and it comes from lots of different places. Just as a quick aside, I did learn recently of a word. It's called a leaf. It's a philosophical concept, a leaf versus belief. And then a leaf is a belief you don't believe with, you don't agree with.
I like that. I should make a list of my leaves just to note them down.
So the point is, we carry around this equation, if you will, or equivalency, it might be a better term, in our minds, where we I think it's the law of commutativity, where we equate our worth with our performance. And so just to illustrate the utility of this idea or proof of concept, if you're thinking, just think about those of you who are listening, you're writing a paper, or you have a piece set due, or you're writing code, and you have a due date, and you're feeling the intensity of it, and you're stressed, and you have this, your heart's racing, and you've been up for long periods of time. And part of you, if you reflect, you might say, wow, where is all that energy and intensity and emotion coming from? It's just some code. And I would argue it's because we carry around this, and for me, I have this exactly, I've internalized this message too. What's on the line isn't just my performance, right? Every time I turn in an assignment, yes, my performance is on the line, but if I have this equation, if you will, in my mind, then my worth is on the line too. My sense of who I am in the world, my self-concept, how other people see me. And that would explain why you have such energy and intensity and stress around it, because that paper, it's not just the A or the PSET grade that's on the line, it's your sense of yourself that's on the line. And then if you recognize that, then you can see, oh, yes, that's why I'm having this reaction. And then that's indicative of an underlying, maybe partially aware sense of ourselves and our identification with our work and our ability. So that's the basis of, that's one expression of self-worth theory, and particularly around achievement motivation. And that's what my mentor and friend, Marty Covington, who did the decades of research to support this isn't just purely theoretical, this is empirically justified through many experiments, he found. But one expression of that then is, and so there's some counterintuitive consequences of that. So you might think, if my identity's on the line, I'm going to work really hard. And people do. But another thing that's on the line, one of the things that's happened is also people then are avoidant of their tasks, because who wants to be judged in terms of their worth all the time? I feel like I'm a pretty decent person, but I don't want my worth judged all the time. That's a high stake. That's exhausting. And in particular, if my ability is on, so if my sense of my ability is on the line too, for instance, particularly if I've been identified as someone who's really smart, or a genius, or a math whiz, or the science guy, my self-concept can only be harmed or determined, or not only, but can easily be diminished if I do poorly on an exam, for instance.
So we posed this question in our email exchange before the podcast of, why is college so hard for students? And I want to get into it more, but I just want to bring up this one point because it's relevant to self-image and self-worth theory in particular, is that I feel at places like Princeton, you have the top students from all over the world coming together. Many of the times, these students were the best student in their school and have been for a very long time. I know this was the case for someone like myself. And then when you get to Princeton or whatever university you're at, you're then filled with the best students from all over. And so the likelihood that identity gets challenged, where if you're the person that's good at math, and then after the first math test, you get a C or you don't do well, your whole world comes crashing down because you don't have anything to cling on to. Your whole self-image of who you are is shattered in that one test. And I think that's really something that I don't think is talked about enough, that there's in Silicon Valley, and I think I'm going to draw a parallel to the startup world, often people value, so performance is a thing that's valued a lot. And one of the venture capitalists named Ben Horowitz wrote a book called What You Do Is Who You Are. And I think that I would push back on that. I disagree with I think it's a nice title, but the implications of that is really almost horrifying, where you're not, your intrinsic worth as a person or your ability to do something isn't just reflected by your performance on a single test or a single assignment or project or something like that. And I think what really gets people down and can lead to almost a downward spiral, where whole careers or whole academic careers are destroyed, where they don't pick up on that fact, where they do think, I'm a failure at this and this is something that I want to do. And then they go searching for their new purpose or whatever it is. And you see this all the time in university, where someone comes in thinking that they want to major in physics or engineering or something like that. And then 3 months later, they end up being anthropology major or something else. And in many cases, that's just a natural consequence of them fully exploring their curiosity and looking at things that they've never had exposure to before. But in another sense, it's a reaction to the fact that my self-image has been challenged and I need to find this other thing to cling on to because I can no longer call myself the person that's good at maths or science.
Really well said. And I think there's so many things you just said.
There's a lot to unpack there.
But I think I'll pick up one of the last things because it's concrete. And although I imagine most of your listeners are in the professional world and work world, they may have experienced this or seen this. And I certainly see it at Princeton is a lot of students, you said, they may give up this dream they had, a vision for themselves, a career, a calling. I can't tell you how many students who they envision themselves being astronauts or mechanical engineers or doctors. And after that first math or physics class, literally have been thinking this for most of their lives. And then 4 weeks in after a Princeton exam, they're like, I guess I'm not going to do that. So that shows, so why is that? If we really examine that, now, like you said, sometimes it's a natural and appropriate response in finding interest, but a lot of times it's not being directed by, I want to be an anthropologist. It's an escape. It's a avoidance of this other thing. So I sometimes call that the non-STEM, because not always, but a lot of times it happens in STEM.
Yeah, simply because STEM is, I think the jump from non-STEM to STEM in college is particularly marked.
And and STEM culture is also can be quite exclusionary.
That's true.
They're actually quite interested and embrace this idea of selecting people from the beginning. And there's actually empirical evidence that shows the STEM fields tend to, well, that's like this. I'm going to say something. I was going to say something unfair to STEM, but so I won't say that. But what else? So one thing I've observed, and it's from a motivational perspective that would add on to a self-worth theory, is an approach avoidance lens, which is sometimes what you have is students who are essentially, whatever their major is, what they really are is non-STEM majors.
Yeah, interesting.
They've just not pursued that because that's too threatening. Now, wherever they ended up is where they ended up, but they actually didn't strive for that. They weren't propelled toward that. They weren't compelled toward that. They were actually going away from a particular field. This is directly analogical, and I think it's a really important thing to understand about procrastination is how it's avoidance. So the quintessential example, and I'm just going to try to draw an analogy here of at the micro level of an individual person in a particular week, and how that's analogous to picking a major. So the quintessential cliche of procrastination is you're cleaning the refrigerator the night before your exam, right? So that's, oh yeah, I have my exam tomorrow in physics and I'm cleaning out the refrigerator, and you justify it, say, the refrigerator stinks, I need to clean it. And so you have an explanation to hand, and it's true. For my purposes, to understand whether that's procrastination or not, we need to ask a little bit different question. We need to not ask, is it rational? Is there an explanation? We need to say, are you cleaning the refrigerator motivationally because it's dirty? Or are you cleaning the refrigerator to avoid studying for the physics exam? Because it's dirty and you can give an explanation, but that may be a reason, but that's not necessarily a motivation. It's not necessarily your motivation. So the distinction is what's motivating you, and we can make a fundamental distinction. Are you motivated to clean the refrigerator, or are you motivated to find a reason to avoid studying physics? And those are very different motivational dynamics. Similarly, people can end up in history or psychology, or even another STEM field that was not so charged. They've been, if you think like magnets, they've been repelled away from that thing. And so what they end up doing is simply being guided by their fears.
I think one thing that comes up for me is if you think about the emotional intensity, or the intensity of the emotional experience that people then associate with that field, where, say, for example, you have someone who is running away from computer science or engineering or something like that. And it could be the opposite for engineers in a writing class or something like that, where they're now being led by running away from their fears. And it's very similar to how I notice a lot of people, and I've dealt with this in my own life, is how we just deal with fear and challenge in daily life, where when something is not going our way, we then reach for the thing that we can escape it from, whether it's scrolling Instagram, whether it's eating the chocolate or the sweets or whatever it is. This is simply a macro manifestation of that behavior with perhaps much more dire consequences, because it's about what are you going to major in, and sometimes very difficult to reverse decisions that you're going to make.
Precisely. And I think one of the consequences is when we're motivated by fear, works so long as you're afraid. It also has, and someone who studies motivation, that fear as a motivator has very different consequences than passion or interest or other intrinsic reasons. So it's human. I'm not judging it. I've been motivated by fear many times. And so it's not to say, oh, you're bad if you feel fear or you fear failure. That's human. I think actually some of the discourse out there about failure doesn't really recognize the full sensitivity and fragility that people have. Failure hurts. No matter its rational benefits, emotionally, it's very painful. And it's about, one of the reasons it is because of the meaning we derive from a failure on a particular task. And what that can mean for many people is I'm not who I thought I was. So failure on a task or even a startup or a business, that is not sufficient. We need to understand the meaning. And so failure is an experience. It's not an outcome, or it is also an outcome, but it's mainly, if we want to understand it psychologically, we need to understand it as an experience. So what am I getting at? That means we can rationally know that Edison failed thousands of times. That was really beneficial, and it's an opportunity to start again better. But emotionally, that's not what it is. Self-concept, and in terms of our self-concept, that's not what it is. We need to account for all of those meanings that we make of failure. And when we have been told and identified that we're geniuses and experts, the nature of genius is that means always and forever. So any given example, any given failure is disproof that you are a genius. Because if you're a genius, you're always a genius.
It just takes one example to get everything crumbling down.
So that's a lot of pressure, right? And so maybe, and I'll just stop here just to exemplify this to see if I can help people relate to it. Their audience or people who may have been this person, they always get a 99, but the day before on the task, but the day before they're like, oh my God, I'm gonna fail. And you're your friend and you're telling them, look, you always get a 99. What are you talking about? It makes no sense. But it does make sense if you understand it from a self-worth perspective. Because if you're a genius, you should get a 99 no matter what. Now, and then I guess it's not the last point, it's the second to last point. Now, if what's on the line then is not just the grade, in fact, not mainly the grade, but our sense of ourselves, then there's ways that we will, and self-worth theory makes this claim, that self-worth theory says the paramount human need is to be understood by ourselves and others as capable and able and smart. And if that becomes wrapped up in our identity, we will actually sacrifice performance to maintain that self-concept. So we'll actually subordinate the actual achievement and attainment in order to be thought of as smart and brilliant. So that's what procrastination is. That's one interpretation from a self-worth perspective is, if I procrastinate and I put off investing time and effort, then what I'm able to do is, regardless of my performance on the test, I've protected my self-concept as smart. Because if I perform well, then I've confirmed that I am smart. But if I perform poorly, then I can attribute not to my ability, but to my preparation. I didn't study, I procrastinated. And so it's some people call it self-sabotaging. I would say it's performance sabotaging, but it's self-protection.
Exactly. You're protecting that identity of yourself.
And it's the perfect strategy. Because if you do that, regardless of the outcome, you can say, oh, I'm smart. And that, again, is a human need. I'm not judging anybody. It's a human need. But this is one of the counterintuitive ways that this P A equals W, some of the consequences of that, how it manifests.
I think that that's a huge takeaway for people who experience procrastination, which I think is every human in the world, to ask themselves, I ask myself the question, what am I running away from? What am I fearing by doing this? And I think often that the answer is, I'm not going to attempt at all because I'm fearful for not doing a perfect job. A lot of people have this saying that perfect is the enemy of good. When we have this idea that we need to be perfect and we need to reach this benchmark or this standard, we end up doing nothing versus showing up, putting ourselves on the line and taking a stab at it. One of the authors that I found to be most instrumental in my understanding of performance, but also understanding of how to do good work is a lady by the name of Brene Brown, who talks a lot about, I think, vulnerability, but also these kinds of things about self-worth and showing up every day and putting yourself on the line. And so I recommend people to check that out. I want to just wrap up this section on self-worth before I ask you about this idea of intrinsic motivation. But on self-worth, So we understand that self-worth theory is a thing. We understand about this fallacy that performance equates with ability and worth. How can we then take this and apply it into our lives as people or as students? What would you say is some ways to go about actually taking this and making it something not just that we know about, but something that we acting upon in our lives?
Very good question. And I think there are a couple of broad approaches. And one focuses on the consequences of carrying around this set of beliefs, or to use this term I just learned, beliefs. And another comes from trying to change them. So even if we disagree, but we've been conditioned, it's hard to change. There's a saying, you can't reason people out of things they weren't reasoned into. So we weren't reasoned into holding these beliefs. So now I think there is a cognitive process, and the research does say, from this point of view, that self-awareness is the most useful strategy. And we don't often think of self-awareness as a strategy, but that is one way. Simply to know, like you said, you have now a question to ask. Okay, all people are running to something and away from something pretty much all the time. So I'm often more aware of what I'm running to, but what am I running away from? And then I can examine that and say, is that health? It's understandable. If you're feeling that's real, that's understandable. That question is that help me? Is it disadvantageous? So that's looking at the consequence. I feel this thing. There's other things I can do in terms of overcoming procrastination. And then and I'll talk about that. And then I'll briefly talk about, as best I can, addressing the root causes of self-worth in those dynamics. But I think one thing is we feel these fears, and all of us have felt fears about all kinds of things. And we found ways to overcome them. So sometimes people say the strategy is don't be afraid, or just deal with failure, just feel the fear. I actually think that is not the most common way people deal with their fears. I actually think it's something a little more subtle. If you can tap into your intrinsic motivations, and especially in your approach motives, it's not that the fear goes away, it just diminishes in relative size. So it's not that I'm not fearful. So I want to jump out of an airplane because I want to feel what it's like to do skydiving. I'm not afraid of that. But if I tap into the exhilaration of that, what it feels like, or the equivalent might be diving in the Great Barrier Reef and there's sharks. It's not that I'm no longer afraid of sharks. It's, relatively speaking, what's in my mind, in my consciousness, is the thing that I want. And so the fear shrinks, and I don't have to actually deal with that directly sometimes. It's propping up my intrinsic motivations. It's propping up my passions, my mission. It's not inventing them. It's not pretending. It's simply putting my attention on those things. And I think that comports with people's common sense, or even the movies. When you see the movies and somebody overcomes a big problem, what we know, the montage is they're connected to their passion. It's not that the problem's diminished. It just, right, they didn't go away. It's just that the passion was bigger. So exactly. I call this motivational stacking.
I like it. I think one thing that people can take away is you always see these movies where someone's family member gets kidnapped and they go through everything to try and get them back. That's how you can think about it, where the why for why you're doing something is so much greater than the fear and the obstacles that you have to overcome.
Exactly. And that we oftentimes have those reasons, but we don't have tools for turning them into motivations and intentions. So motivational stacking is a way to turn these reasons. So a common consultation question is, why'd you come to Princeton? Why are you in this major? Why are you in this class? Why did you sign up? And it's not to interrogate them. It's actually to help them to remember those reasons. But if those reasons are not in my mind at the moment of decision making, or the moment when I work, then I might as well not have them. So I have to actively and consciously and intentionally turn these reasons, which are abstract, into felt motivations. And I do that by putting my attention on them, by remembering that. And so I then have techniques for doing that. You write them out, you read them into your phone, you put them on your reminders, and you bring those genuine, true, real, powerful motivations into your consciousness on a regular basis to counteract the real fears that you have. So that's one approach. And then there's other more concrete, specific techniques that are more common to overcoming procrastination. I won't get into those. But then the more fundamental question that people ask me, which is much harder to answer, and I'm not sure I'm the person to answer this actually, is yeah, but how do I not equate my worth with my ability and my performance? That is a philosophical question. It may be a therapeutic question. I think it's much, I do have some opinions, but I can't say that I'm skilled or particularly knowledgeable about that. I think, but I can say a few things. So some people who find their worth by virtue of being endowed by a creator, often these are religious people, then they just say, oh, right, my worth is not attached to my ability. I think something similar, people who have very powerful and tangible values and are driven by them, they can get outside of that. Another way I help people get outside of this, at least to put in question, is to actually ask them, well, who is valuable to you in your life? And how important is their GPA or their transcript in that equation for you? And they're like, not at all. Or people who have been significant in the world. I don't know Gandhi's GPA. I have no idea what his transcript looked like. That's not what his meaning, the value was. And then other ways so I think it's maybe examining and reflecting upon how other people are meaningful and valuable and worthy to you. And then this is a fundamental principle both of Buddhism and psychology, which is, can you treat yourself with the compassion you would treat others? Yeah.
I think it's to elaborate on what you talked about on self-worth theory and how do you stop having a conditional self-worth or having a self-worth conditioned on your performance. It's actually something that I wrote about last week in my newsletter, where I reflected on the fact that, like many people in difficult academic environments, by doing well at a young age, you then become conditioned to placing the value about yourself on these external outcomes like grades, like university acceptances. You see this kind of change as you go through Princeton, where it starts to become the internship that you got, the full-time offer that you got, the salary that you make. In the university context, it's most explicitly grades because we're being conditioned as that's, okay, this means a certain thing. But then there's also these other subtle things that people hook their self-worth on, like salary, like status in society and stuff like that. And I think one of the things...
Externals, yeah.
Exactly. All these external things that you're basing your self-worth on. And I also ended that newsletter by saying, I don't have any answers. There's just questions that I can ask. And I think it's a journey that we're all trying to navigate in our own way. And I think, as you said, by thinking about things like your values, your purpose, something that goes beyond yourself as someone who does things in the world, and someone as thinking about yourself as like a person who is and a being, that is the route that I personally found to be most fruitful. But obviously it's different for everyone.
Yeah, I would just add one point. I think in terms of the book and the theoretical orientation to motivation that I adopt, and I really reflects my mentor, is that actually external rewards, extrinsic rewards, and intrinsic and worth, they can coexist with achievement.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's the issue. And so some people would disagree with that and say, to the extent that you're focused on achievements and externals, then you're undermining the complement, which is intrinsic motivations and inherent value. And that may be the case, but I don't hold that view. And certainly motivationally, for instance, again, some people say that if we use extrinsic rewards, there's a guy named Alfie Kohn who wrote a book called Punished by Rewards. He would say, to the extent that we focus on rewards, this will undermine intrinsic motivation. But I think common sense tells us that they can coexist. So whether that be a professional athlete who loves playing their sport and is quite happy to be making $20 million a year and win most valuable player, they can coexist. Now they can also, the focus on achievement can vitiate and undermine a true passion and love. But the point isn't that externals are bad, I think, or negative. To me, it's the single-minded focus on that, or the 100%. Meaning that those come to have. Then I think that ultimately will be a recipe for dissatisfaction, for fear, anxiety. But rewards in the right external rewards combined with intrinsic passion, they can simply augment our motivation. Professors are a good example of that. Princeton professors, they will tell you, they love their discipline. They're fascinated by it. They're also quite happy to have tenure at Princeton. That can be tricky. That can be a balance, but it's certainly possible to maintain those. And that's important because I don't think you have to be somehow motivationally pure, or
Exactly. That's it.
that's not
Yeah.
necessary.
And I think you hit the nail on the head, and it's something that I'm actively experiencing right now, which is how do you achieve external things? For example, doing well in your job, growing your audience is an example that's similar to grades, where you constantly see every day, these are the
Yeah.
numbers, these are the analytics, while also remaining true to your internal motivations and things where it's a cop out to say, you should just not worry about externals at all and just do it for your own internal motives, which I think has to be the priority, as you said. But at the same time, there's nothing ironically intrinsically wrong with these
Right.
external motivators. It's not that it's not a question of morality. It's simply a question of effectiveness of if you do focus on them, chances are you're going to end up basically anxious and fearful. And it's a question of utility versus morality at the end of the day.
You said that so well. I'm so glad you did, because I think it gets conflated, especially in the academic environment. Oh, that you should learn for learning's sake, and that somehow this is morally better. And that is reflective of the moral values, at least the professed moral values of the university. But I say things that sound similar, but not through a moral lens. It's because it's more useful and actually will lead to your own well-being, your
100%.
happiness. And so the justification is an entirely different kind of justification. And so I'm glad you mentioned that, because it can be conflated. And I've had people say, oh, you're just parroting these values of the institution, which I understand why they've said that. But the distinction you made extremely well, I think, challenges that.
Thank you for that. It's again, this is stuff that I'm experiencing in my daily life right now and just trying to make sense of it. I want to ask you some quick fire questions just to change it up. So the first question is, with regards to learning and thriving and performance, what's something that you often hear given as good advice that's actually bad advice?
I think maybe one point to start with is something I'll pick up on this last point, that certain kinds of motivations are inherently better and the other ones aren't good. I think it's more nuanced than that. And my belief is that any motivation that helps you productively and constructively engage in the tasks and activities toward a thoughtful, intentional, meaningful goal is appropriate to utilize. The utility is the crucial thing. Does it help you move toward a valued, meaningful, hopefully noble end? If so, let's use it. And that's one thing. I think another kind of advice, that maybe it's not even advice, but often, I think there's a lot of messages that people are hard on themselves. And I think actually it's better to be compassionate and accepting to yourself. But I don't know if people are going around saying, be hard on yourself. I think it's not advice so much as it is it's implicit or entailed in the messages that people are giving out about achievement and productivity.
Got it. That makes a ton of sense. Next question is, what's a book or resource that's most influenced your perspective on learning? This can be anything you've read recently or all the way back to your university days.
I'll use this there's a number of them. I'll use an example this question to mention a hero who I've never met, although I almost had the chance to meet him. His name is Mike Rose. He's an emeritus, so therefore a somewhat retired professor at UCLA. He's written a number of books, and he wrote a book called Lives on the Boundary. So you may remember this, Avthar. That was one of the first.
We read a little bit of this in our training for becoming learning consultants. I remember the title of the book.
What Mike Rose exemplifies, he doesn't just talk about it, but he exemplifies, he illustrates, and he demonstrates, and he's a very skilled writer in this book, is a very holistic approach to students and student learning, and understanding the social dimensions, the moral dimensions, the motivational dimensions, the cultural dimensions, by doing careful observation and respect of students and examining their motivations and their reasons, but also doing that in a very humane, interactive way, where he's really saying, I'm going to learn from you. And so he reveals what I would say is the complexity of learning. And I'm attached to that idea that we can't just read things off. It's not just a cognitive question. It's not only a motivational question. It's not only a cultural question. It's an ecological. It's much more complex and nuanced than that. And I took that away, and it influences every other kind of, when I read anything else, I'm always anchored
Using
in
that
that.
lens. Yeah.
Yeah.
Got it. Super interesting. I'm definitely going to check that out now that you've reminded me of it. And
Mhm.
maybe I'll write like a book review or summary on it just to summarize it for other people. The next question that I want to ask is, so the title of this podcast is called Learn with Avthar. Ironically, in our conversation today, we focused a lot on explicitly the topic of learning, but usually that's not the case. But one question I'd like to ask all the guests that come on here is, what's something that you've learned about recently that you're excited about?
Yeah, there's two things. I'll mention one and then focus on another. So one is I've been dabbling in Buddhism and the principles of Buddhism for a long time, and I bring a framework of motivation and cognitive psychology and positive psychology, and I'm constantly amazed at how the empirical science of Buddhism, and it is empirical, it's observational, it's not experimental, but it's empirical, has revealed great insights about human psychology that Western psychology is barely now catching up to. And so I came across a couple of books that talk about I would say the methods of becoming a bodhisattva, the bodhisattva's way. So one is the actual text called the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. I just recently read the Dalai Lama's book, which is a commentary on that through his multitude of scholarly insight. But another book and another perspective that I've gotten is from a physician and writer named Gabor Mate. Have you ever heard of Gabor Mate?
I have actually. He was on the Tim Ferriss show a while ago. I listened to one of
Right.
his interviews. Yeah.
I didn't watch that, but I saw a picture. I kept on my
Yeah.
YouTube feed.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll put the link in the show notes for people to check it out.
Yeah. So one thing I took away from that, from his book called When the Body Says No, is how is really to undermine this mind-body distinction, this duality, and recognize that the organism is a whole, and that we have a interconnected system of the psychoneuroimmunological system, the PNI, which is an interpretive system of meaning making that collects information about the internal status of the organism and the external status of the organism. And then along with the brain is part of that, but the gut is part of that, but so is our lymphatic system, our endocrinal system, and our immune system. And so we see this integration of mind body, I'm going to not make that distinction, in health, because we're getting all these messages back and forth. And so a crucial thing that is really interesting to me, and how our neurological and immunological systems are interpreting, they're actually making meaning and then sending that information to our nervous system. It's not only one direction.
Yeah, it's a conversation between them almost. Yeah.
Yeah.
Super interesting.
Yeah.
That kind of reminds me of a lot of the stuff that I read about before on the gut-brain connection, and also similar to some of the stuff that Gabor Mate mentions, which is this whole idea of like somatic awareness. I think there's a couple of like Eastern scholars who talk about this concept as well. Definitely a whole rabbit hole to go down. On the next quickfire question is, what have you changed your mind about recently, or what is something that you used to think was true that you no longer believe is the case?
It's interesting. I'm going to take this probably in a direction you didn't imagine.
Go for it.
Yeah. It's a little biography, and maybe a little too revelatory. I hope not. I've been in therapy at least a couple times, maybe 3, psychotherapy. And for the most part, I've always been a healthy person. And I think actually psychotherapy is best when we're basically okay, because it gives us a chance to really examine and explore. We're not in crisis. And I've been fortunate enough to be able to do that. And so I thought I'd figured some things out, and I understood myself. And of course, when I think about how learning happens, that was a silly assumption. So what I've come to change my mind about is, oh, I figured that, I did that, I figured that out. I understand who I am, where I've come from. And that's just, it's not true. Or that's constantly being revealed and understood in new phases of life. I could talk about, even the Gabor Mate book helped me rethink something about the human organism, but I just chose to do that because self-knowledge is a theme that's running through our conversation.
100%.
Yeah. And an obstacle to self-knowledge is thinking you know.
Exactly.
And it's really crucial to unlearn things if we're going to learn new things.
Yeah, thinking that you already know something is the biggest barrier to letting yourself learn it. It's basically the biggest impediment for learning to take place.
So the problem, may even be, I don't know if this quote made it into the book, Life Beyond Grades, but the problem isn't what people know. It's the fact is what they know is wrong. And so how do we unpack that? How do we unlearn it to create a new space where we can understand things? So yeah.
Awesome. I really like that. It's a revelation that I've had in my own life several times, fortunately or unfortunately. So you're definitely not alone in that. It's definitely part of the human experience. One more short question, then I want to chat about this topic of why is college so hard? If you had the time, I know we've been talking for a little bit now, but I definitely want to touch on that because I just think it's worthy of examination. But the last quick fire question is, when you hear the word successful, who's the first person that comes to mind?
You said this in advance. I was really struck by that, and nobody.
That's okay. That's a good answer too.
Yeah. Now I don't know why that is. It gave me pause. I think, and it didn't hit me till right now, but I think maybe that I think success is an internal experience. So I can't really know who feels themselves to be successful.
Uh-huh.
That's it. Yeah, that's it. Thank you for asking that, because I don't think I could know. I wouldn't know, because my definition of what success is so idiosyncratic, personal, and it has to do with one's own meaning that I could never know. And so I can't observe that. So I couldn't know who's successful.
There's a wonderful quote by a creative slash entrepreneur called Derek Sivers, who says that, it's very difficult to answer this question about who is successful because, as you mentioned, it has to do with their own internal motives. If we look at someone who's, let's say, a common answer to this question might be someone like Elon Musk, who's a big CEO, or Jeff Bezos or something like that. But what if Jeff Bezos, all he wants is to just live a quiet life away from the media spotlight and go fishing every day, and for some reason he's compelled to start all these companies? Is that actually successful? In his mind, probably not. He's probably like, I can't help but run these companies and make profit. I just wanted to relax, but I can't do it. So maybe he's not successful. And so I think that takeaway from what you just uncovered, which is everyone needs to have their own definition of success, and ultimately it's an intrinsic thing. It's something that you can only experience for yourself. You can't look at someone and say, that person is successful. They might be successful in your own eyes, but maybe in their eyes they're not.
Mm-hmm.
Got it. Really cool answer to that question. I haven't had anyone said no one so far, so that was really interesting. I want to close on this topic of why is college so hard, because I think that you mentioned that this is a topic that you want to chat a little bit about, and I've jotted down 3 or 4 points of why I think this is the case. But I think just to provide some context for this, a lot of the time, as you mentioned before, if someone does badly in school or if someone does badly in university, or let me rephrase that, if someone doesn't perform as expected, the blame is shifted onto them. It's their problem. It's something is wrong with them. The student is not working hard enough. You're partying too much. And that might be the case for some people. But on the other hand, I think the question that you pose is that there might be a more holistic approach to this, where we look at not just the student, but how they interact with other students, the context of the university, the community, the courses that they're taking. And so I'm curious about how you think about this topic. Why is college so hard? And I can chat about the points that I have thought up as we go.
Actually, you kind of nailed it. You pretty much said what I would say, that so we spent a fair bit of time talking about these differences between the college and what students are prepared for. And I would argue, we often talk about, or in the discourse, the discussion, we say, oh, students are underprepared or they're unprepared. And I always like to say, is the institution prepared for the students? And that may sound like a little syntactic or linguistic, game or something, but actually let's dwell on that for a second. Students can't know much about universities. They're 18 or 19 or whatever. But universities every year bring in a new batch of students. We should know more about students. We should know about them. And we should know what the challenges they're likely to face. But actually, universities have relatively little knowledge about K-12 education and students. So you may have heard, I don't know if you've ever heard this, but there's a funny saying attributed to a Harvard professor, is that universities are places where amateurs teach beginners to become experts.
That's a wonderful quote. I've never heard of it before, but it really does have some truth to it.
So universities are, professors are amateur teachers. They're not expert teachers. We talked about that. Most of the people who run universities are scholars. They're not administrators. They're not professionals in that field. They're amateurs. So I would argue, and that many universities are simply not prepared for the task that they do. Now, it's actually probably the case that's not so unusual to any profession, but that's another matter. So one of the things is we're not prepared for the students that we actually get. So it's not surprising that the students are challenged, but the usual framework, as you pointed out, the blame, the attribution always goes to something wrong with the student. And when you're not dealing with a place like Princeton or Harvard or Berkeley, very few people question that. But if you're dealing with the best students in the world, it's really hard to accept this with any kind of critical thinking. Like, how can it be that so many students at Princeton are struggling? Maybe it's not about them. I had a colleague say that if one fish washes up dead on the shore, then you think, what's wrong with that fish? But if a bunch of fish do, you say, what's wrong with the water?
Exactly. So what's poisoning them?
Yeah. And at Princeton, they're not washing up dead, fortunately, but there's a lot of unhappiness. There's a lot of struggle. There's a lot of suffering, and not a little bit of escape. People just checking out. I think this is too much. And it's not just Princeton. That's just what I know.
Yeah.
So it's not particular to Princeton. So first, that teaches us college is hard. And we can explain in a very concrete way about teaching and learning and the demands and all that's new. Like living and moving into any new culture is hard and demanding. But then when we add in the self-worth lens, then we see that the meaning that students make of that makes it, not only does that make it painful, it makes it harder yet again, because that undermines motivation and engagement. People then become protective and defensive for completely understandable reasons for being a human being, but that makes school and academics much harder. There's other reasons as well, but that's a really powerful dynamic, and where people are in these elite places are not getting the information, the knowledge and experience they need, and then also the interpretive framework. And much of this their students are bringing with them, but some of it is in the institution itself. But one of the reasons it's hard is because the universities don't change. And the reason the universities don't change is because one of the arguments I would make is that by some measures, the universities are achieving. Princeton's alums like you are going out and getting good jobs. Some percentage of them, and then they're making money and giving money back to Princeton. Some percentage of them are earning Rhodes scholarships. We don't really ask, do they feel like they're living a good life? Do we ask them, do they know how to live a good life? Do they feel better about themselves having been at Princeton than they were before? I would call that well-being, a sense of self-regard. Very few colleges are doing that. And because that's not measured, the institution doesn't change.
Exactly. It comes back to that whole thing about what are the incentives of the institution? What do they get rewarded for? Is it US News rankings? Is it other things? Versus the incentives of the student, which is to be happy and get whatever they're trying to get out of university, which is their degree or get into grad school or whatever it may be.
And so that's another dimension here that we haven't talked about too much, is that places like Princeton and Berkeley, they're attached to this idea of a liberal arts college, knowledge for its own sake. But that's not the primary motivation for most students. And there's lots of ways that gets manifest. But that's a lot of frustration and confusion when you come to an institution that you imagine is preparing you for the workforce, and it says, that's not my job. At least your courses, your professors aren't saying that. So that's where most of your energy is. That's a big disconnect.
One of the reasons that I noted down for why I think college is so difficult is that there's so many different motivations that students have, and the school doesn't necessarily explicitly endorse any of them. And so on this point about coming in with different motivations, one of the reasons why people commonly study computer science is because of the job prospects. But unfortunately, as one of the professors, I think Princeton professor Arvind Narayanan had a Twitter thread about this maybe last year sometime. I'll try and pull it up for people to check it out. But it's that computer science programs don't teach programming. They don't teach software engineering. They teach you mathematics and computational thinking and computer science. And it's up to the student, in the same way that they have to transfer their knowledge to the exam, to transfer that knowledge into the job context to get a job in software engineering or something like that. And so I think that's one example. The other example is some students want to go to grad school. Other students want to become researchers. Other students want to go and become entrepreneurs or do service jobs or work in government. And I think that's one thing about everyone is coming in with all these different motivations, but they're also coming from a place where they've followed that ladder to success, where when you're in high school, you judge how successful you are based on what university you get into. And everyone has ticked the box of getting into the best university, Princeton, Harvard, Stanford, whatever it may be. But now their motivations and their goals are for them to choose. There's no one telling you that, okay, this is the next step. This is the thing that everyone has to aim for, because now that's up to your choice. And I think that if for the first time, maybe ever, students need to decide what's important for them. And because most people don't take the time to think about that question, or because most people have never ever thought about what do I actually want to do after I get into my dream school, that is an added layer of complexity and like stress to people, because they have to figure out, quote unquote, what you want to do with your life, or what is your goal, what you actually want to do, in the context of the urgency of the papers, the assignments that you have to do, the clubs that you have to join. If you want to jump in, you're welcome to at this point. Yeah.
You named, there's three big topics that and I'll pick up this last one. And I think that what we should expect from 18 to 22-year-olds who are in college is that a big thing that's on their mind is how they're going to live their life. As colleges are focused on research and specialization, faculty do not see that as part of their job, and they're not prepared to do that. There's really no place in the university, or very few places in the university, for students to have those conversations. So this is what I'm getting at about being amateurs. If you know about the developmental process of human beings who are 18 to 22-year-old, this is what they're thinking about. But it's not systematically built into the university in any important ways. Historically, it would have been, and I won't get into that too much, but the contemporary, purely secular, hyper-specialized research university, it's not built in very much. And if it is, it's not in the fundamental fabric of the institution. You might find a conversation in the Office of Religious Life or some other pockets, but it's not really built in. But if you think about it, we know that's what people in this age group are thinking about and on the cusp of career, and we should want to intervene. This other thing, why college is hard, the phrase, I think you talked about, you gave the example of the computer science professor saying, what we do in the university is not prepare people for the kinds of jobs that students imagine. We're not preparing you how to code. And it's reflected in the name of the department at Princeton, which is computer science. It's not coding.
Exactly.
And I would say that just one thing I would add is, and so some students will say, yes, we're not preparing you for the real world. And so I don't like that. The university is, because it implies the university in the real world. Like I live and work there, like it's real to me. So and I'm a real person, so it's real. But I do understand what they're getting at, which is it's a very different world. It's a very specific world with a different set of values. And that difference is real. And because nowadays, people who are not inclined to be in the academy devalue that kind of learning, they say that's not real.
Yeah.
What's real is me being out there in Apple. I've been to the Apple campus. That is not the real world. There's no way the Apple campus is the real world. That's some slice of tech heaven. It's a weird slice. That is not the real world any more than Princeton University is the real world, or it's its own real world. So the point being there that universities of a certain ilk really have no interest in preparing people for careers, which is what you said. But it's not only economics. There's a saying on Wall Street that if you hire a PhD in economics, it takes them as long to unlearn what they learned in their doctoral program as it did to learn it. So you have to unlearn all that stuff before they're going to be useful for you on Wall Street. They got all these tools, but they learned all this stuff that's really not very applicable to the kind of questions that business or hedge funds are engaged with. And I think the antidote to that and to recognize the value of education is to say, this is a different community, it has different values. And then it's not what I want necessarily, but that is how I get it. Then how do I get what I want and need? And if the approach is simply to get good grades, you will not get a good education. You have to say, what does the university do? What is it good at? And then how do I get the things that are it's good at giving me? And then where do I get the other things? And that's a level of intention and thoughtfulness and strategy that, again, I certainly do not have an 18 or 19 or 20-year-old. So we need some guidance. Students need some guidance about how to navigate the university, how to get out of it what they want. So I like to use this phrase of get an education. So get can sound passive, but get can mean go get.
It's an active process. It's
Yeah.
you leveraging the different resources that you have at your disposal in order to achieve whatever goal that you have.
So you can go to college, but that doesn't mean you're going to get an education. You got to go get it because it's not designed. So the answer, we had a little exchange, is I have this idea for a book. It's called Why College is Hard, or which could be Why is College Hard? And I would say because it's not designed for you. It's not designed for your goals, for what you so nicely said about the different motivations. That is not what it's designed to do.
I think that's such a profound point. And to go back to repeat it one more time, because I think it deserves repeating, is that students need to use the university as a vehicle to achieve their goals. And it's a very active process. By going through the classes and things like that, if you just take the standard path, whatever that may be, chances are that's not going to be tailored to your specific goals and to the things that you want to achieve. But whenever I mentor or counsel current university students or high schoolers who are looking to go to places like Princeton, who are international students, who are current students there, I always tell them, look, one of the things that I've learned is that no one is going to give you anything. Like by just thinking you're going to do well in your classes, it's not going to magically show your worth to any potential employer. It's not going to get you into grad school or whatever like that. Some of those may be subcomponents of it, but ultimately learning is a very active process. You've got to go out there and really create that experience for yourself. And I think one of the benefits of liberal arts is that it allows you to do that with the classes and stuff that you take. And that's something that I'm very grateful for. Took a lot of philosophy and stuff like that, where I actively thought about these questions of how to live well and apply it to my classes. But I also think there's some other programs. I know when I was at Princeton, they had this career and life vision program, which I really think should be a whole course that everyone should take versus like an hour-long seminar or something like that. Just as a starting point, obviously, it's not going to take you all the way there. But I think those kinds of things where you think about, look, everyone's going to have their own motivations. Here's how you can leverage the different resources in the university to get there. It's like when I used to be a learning consultant, if someone was saying, look, here's the outcome that I want to achieve, how can I get there? We would recommend, here's the different resources at your disposal. You got to find the ones that work best for you. There's office hours, there's a textbook, there's, other students. You've got to figure out how to make the use of these different things at your disposal. Go ahead.
I really like this idea of thinking about how you use the university. I'm going to make a little pun here. Let's call it the usiversity.
I like it. Yeah, that's a good title for a blog post.
Yeah. And that changes the orientation, right? Is it you fitting into the university or is it you making use of the university?
Exactly. One thing that I wanted to bring up as well, and it's about this idea of deciding what's important to you, is this on the topic of the community that students are in, is this mimetic influence that we're exposed to where the things that other people value, you're being exposed to that. And then as a result, you're placing value in that. And one of the phrases that I like to use to encapsulate this is, if you hang around 4 friends who think that grad school is the right thing to do after graduating, then you will naturally become the 5th person. And in the same way, again, people have different motivations. Some people want to go to grad school. Some people want to go to industry. Others want to go to service. Others want to go into government, whatever it may be. The fact that there's all these different influences and each person is saying, this is the right way, in brackets, for me, but they don't say the last part. They just say, this is the right thing to do because I've convinced myself to do it. And so that's what also makes it difficult, is because you're fighting all these different influences, and eventually you have to tune out the world, the voice of the world or the other people and telling what you should do, and decide for yourself according to what you value and live according to that. And I think something we talked about earlier, bringing it back to your motivation, your purpose, those are all very useful concepts to keep in mind when you're trying to decide how can you escape the influence of what other people you think you should do, or what you think is cool because other people are doing it, versus what you actually want to do for your own reasons.
I think that's really powerfully influencing. Princeton is a very powerful culture. And so I see what you're describing operating all the time. And for students who are even very aware of it and who have very clear aims, have been influenced by particularly the career prestige and the hierarchy that the Princeton students tend to carry around in that community. I think one of the things I would just add to that is I think we don't have maybe not very useful conversations on campus. And I suspect there's other places, in part because what this prevailing belief among students is often at odds with the faculty and the institutional values. And so no one wants to talk about it, or it becomes very kind of preachy or moralistic or judgmental, rather than really entertaining. Oh, okay, you're motivated to do that. Great. Why is that? Do you feel that'll bring you fulfillment? But there's not a whole lot of authentic engagement around that, it seems to me. I've learned that's, as a coach, as a consultant, I know what my values are and I have a position, but I also know that they're mine. And I don't feel the need to teach someone or guide them or towards some direction or pathway. It's really about helping them uncover that. And I think that would be really helpful on campus, because these two pre-professional cultures, the student pre-professional culture and the institutional pre-professional culture, are very different. And I'll just stop there. Yeah.
No, I definitely think so. One thing that came to mind was you can see that some of the universities are paying attention to what students might want. And maybe this is because they want to drive up their admissions and make them a more attractive place to study. But one of the things that I benefited a lot from Princeton was the Center for Entrepreneurship, the Keller Center there. And that's probably one of the ways where you have a center that says, okay, if you think that this path is for you, then here's a place with the resources and things that can help you if this is the direction that you want to go, and provide help with internships and stuff like that. So I think the steps in the right direction for different things, but of course it's not all encompassing just yet.
I think that's a really interesting development on Princeton campus, and is illuminating in a number of ways. And so on one hand, it's a response to the need that students have to have some pre-professional preparation and training. There's also a social need for entrepreneurship, and there's some real benefits to Princeton fundraising, to finding a unicorn out of that's in their own best interest. But I think it also says something about that this kind of institution does not do much, and direct pre-professional training unless you want to be an academic.
Exactly. Yeah, that makes sense.
And we're very explicitly pre-professional training there. So sometimes this is my little pet issue, so if you don't mind. So sometimes we'll say liberal arts colleges or research universities, we're not pre-professional training, or we're not instrumental, right? We're not preparing you for a career. That's not entirely true. If you want to be an academic, we are, and we're unabashedly in favor of that. We just don't think of that as what we're doing, but that is absolutely what we're doing. And why that's important is because then it removes this moralistic position that we don't do professional training. Yes, we do. We just do it for one field. Yeah. And the point is, it's not bad. College is a pathway to a career. It is not bad, but I do think, though, it shouldn't only be that. But one of the things it should be is a place, it's something you made use of your education, which is to explore how to live a good life for yourself. And that this is not self-evident, and it's not it's not a purely academic pursuit, nor is it merely a career question. So how do people figure this out?
Exactly. You remind me of a quick anecdote on my side. So when I was in my junior and senior years at Princeton, one of the things we had to do was independent work or research or work on some sort of capstone project in the computer science department. And I remember getting interested in this topic of cryptocurrency and blockchain technology in computer science. And my interest was more around the applications and thinking about how can we turn this into something that people could use. Whereas when I did research with the professors, the incentive there was to look at something where, what is novel that we could do here? What is some sort of solution that we can attach to the existing literature or the existing body of work, versus what I was interested in, which is, to put it bluntly, how can we make this a product and get people out there into the world? And it was only the second time around when I did research where I actually thought about, look, how can I actually align these incentives? And I think when I talk to people about how to do well in university, alignment is one of the primary words that I use, is where, okay, you have this incentives that your professor has where they want you to produce a good research paper. They want to see that you tick all the boxes from their side in terms of engaging with the literature and following the methods and stuff like that. But you also have your own incentives, which for me was to try and build a useful product and demonstrate some of my entrepreneurial predispositions. And that culminated in my senior year where the research product that I did actually turned into a product, which became a company that I ran after graduation. And so that's an example of that idea of alignment is something, again, it's an active process that you have to do. Just by taking a specific class or just by doing a thesis doesn't mean that you're going to achieve an outcome, but it's an opportunity to allow yourself to go towards that kind of outcome, whether it's building a product or exploring a topic that you want to do in more depth. So again, it's up to you to choose at the end of the day.
So interesting that you use that term, because I think one of the key terms. So this question of why college is hard. I mentioned to you, I'm thinking about like a book manuscript with the idea that the subtitle of why college is hard is what are the obstacles to learning achievement and what you can do about it. And probably the organizing principle in terms of what you can do about it is alignment.
100%.
Yeah.
That's
a creative act. It's about, like you said, you're so creative. You had to say, okay, I understand that there's different value systems, different incentive systems. I need to navigate that, and I want to actually help. If I can align them, then I have multiple motivations. I'm using the institutional resources to get to where I want to go. But that takes a lot of critical thinking, strategizing, insight, awareness. And so I'll stop. This will be the last thing I say. Is I would say that if students are going to get the education they want, they need to know about the university. So if you want to know how to do well in the university, you need to know about the university. And there's no books out there that I know of that are written for students that unpack the university and critique it. There are books out there that do that for faculty, for the general public, for administrators, but there's none aimed at students themselves. But that's the knowledge students are going to need if they're going to create the education that they want for themselves.
That gave me an idea for a blog post to potentially write, which is a guide to starting a startup at Princeton and what kind of resources you could leverage. And I think there's all these different domain-specific things. One of the things that you were involved in is Principedia, which is tapping into the knowledge of students for how can they thrive in different classes, not just using the syllabus, but the actual lived experience of different people. And so I think it goes along the same lines.
Interesting.
To wrap up here, this has been such a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for exploring all these different topics. I've certainly learned a lot. If people want to learn more about you and want to follow you online, where can they find you and what would you recommend they check out?
Thank you for raising that. I don't have much of an online presence. I have a LinkedIn account, but I don't have Instagram, or I do have a Facebook page, which I'm sure is out of date and I don't pay much attention to it. So I don't have much of a preference. I think if they want to learn more about the approach that I do, I think the TED Talk is a good one. So that if you look up TED, look for that, my name. I've written a book. If people want to talk with me, I'm not so busy that I can't respond to an email. I got an email yesterday from somebody who actually I got another one today. Somebody who watched the TED Talk. I will respond to that personally. So if you put a comment on my TED Talk, I will actually respond to it on the YouTube page. So I don't know. I think I have mixed feelings about that. I'm not much of a self-promoter. So I think reach out to me. My email is nvogue@princeton.edu. If you watch my TED Talk, if there's a way I can be of help, that's what I'm about. Avthar, that what my mission is to help people live the life that they want to live. My particular focus is on college students. So how do they get the education that they want, and so they can live the life that they want? And if I can help people do that, I would love to do that. I guess I'm putting the onus on them. They'll have to come. I'm old-fashioned. They'll have to come find me.
I think that's good. I like that. Yeah. Have an air of mystery about you. And I was going to say, this has been such a wonderful conversation. Hopefully, we'll do a round 2 in the future as we continue to correspond and talk about things now that we're back in touch. But again, thank you so much for coming on. I'm going to stop the recording now.
Let me say thank you. It's really been a blast. You did a wonderful job. It's great to have an interviewer and a conversation partner that's so thoughtful and intentional.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. I hope everyone has enjoyed listening. And thanks for tuning in today.